Democracy, the cornerstone of the American tradition, our birthright, our passion, and our mission. America is the world's undisputed champion of democracy, seeking to spread the world's best political system to a freedom-starved world. Think of all the Americans who have marched, fought, and died supporting democracy around the world. Yet, what if America is wrong? What if our approach to supporting democracy is actually flawed? What if the advice we give, that countries hold elections as soon as possible, is not the right advice? What if the road to democracy is not what we think it is? Iraq, Afghanistan. We tried, but democracy failed. And not just in those countries. In fact, experts tell us that democracy hasn't spread very far and has actually been in decline around the world for a decade. Dr. Ronald Inglehart, professor of political science at the University of Michigan and co-founder of the World Values Survey, has been studying and researching democracy and how democracy develops for over 50 years. We asked Dr. Inglehart to share with us his perspective on the challenges of becoming a democracy.
There are many countries, I would say, a score at least, maybe 40, of the countries that do hold elections. In fact, the elites manipulate them in various ways, control the access to television, prohibit some of the opposition figures from running, various ways where, though you hold elections, it doesn't really decide policy. There's an oligarchy of one kind or another making the decisions at the top, running the country, and the elections are not really deciding things. So I think it's very important to differentiate between elections are a step in the right direction for sure, but you don't get real democracy unless you have a infrastructure, part of which is culture.
In the 1980s and 90s, China and Russia both came to the same fork in the road. What to do after communism had failed. Russia took one path, acquiring the world-renowned expert on all things economic, Jeffrey Sachs, and his team of economic super strategists to engineer a rapid transition to a free market economy. China took a much different route, making a slow, gradual transition to the free market, all under the leadership of a 4'11" chain-smoking, card-playing septuagenarian who'd been kicked out of his own party 3 times and had virtually no experience in a free market capitalist system. The result may surprise you. China outperformed Russia in just about every economic growth measure there is, and it wasn't even close. Russia's downfall and China's climb to becoming an economic superpower, another glowing example that culture truly matters when transitioning to a free market economy. Consider the topic of corruption. The Corruption Perception Index is used to measure corruption in countries around the world. 100 means no corruption. 0 means total corruption. Note the scores of these countries. All have high levels of corruption, and whether they have elections or not doesn't make a difference. Here's another interesting trend. These are all the countries with low levels of corruption. Notice the difference. Rich countries all have low corruption. Poor countries all have high corruption. You've heard that money is the root of all evil. Is it possible that in reality, money is actually the root of all honesty? Here's another issue. According to a study from the Software Business Alliance, software piracy averages less than 30% among developed countries and almost 70% among developing countries. Another interesting difference between rich and poor countries. What do all of these issues have in common? Rule of law. Less developed countries have weak rule of law.
It just seems like across the board, the wealthier a country is, the more likely there's to be rule of law.
That definitely is true. There's very strong evidence of that. That rule of law is stronger in more developed countries. It's a kind of it's sort of a mutual feedback. I think on one hand, rule of law is crucial to becoming rich, to developing. You need to have rule of law, or the incentives to develop are weak and the rewards for developing are poor. On the other hand, I think it establishes a respect for law, a sense that other people will obey the law, that it's a society in which no individual is above the law, is something that goes with higher and higher development. The more egalitarian, the more democratic a society is, the more the rule of law applies and people sense it and respect it.
Which comes along with the economic development.
Yeah.
We tend to think of the rule of law as a political issue relating to the very top of government. In fact, it is a cultural issue that relates to society at all levels, and it is a big reason why democracy is so difficult. The good news is that cultures change. Looking at all the differences between rich and poor countries, it isn't difficult to see that economic development must be part of driving that change. There's actually a way we can measure how that impacts democratization. Consider the comparison of India and Taiwan, both of which began to chart a new course around 1950. While India held elections very early, it also maintained a highly socialist economy. Taiwan instituted martial law, which it maintained for more than 30 years, but also pursued free market liberalization. Taiwan grew rapidly. India grew hardly at all. Corruption improved in Taiwan. It didn't in India. For many years, according to a democracy rating system developed by researchers, India was more democratic. But then, in a very short period, Taiwan repealed martial law, began holding elections, and became a better democracy than India.
Taiwan into becoming a democracy, which I would say it is, and Freedom House clearly thinks so, was slow, but the institutional change is quick. It's at the elite level. You build up to a certain threshold where most of the population wants democracy. They're good at it, and then it is not. I would say it would be totally unrealistic to say that it's sort of automatic. You reach 70% have self-expression values. Overnight you become a democracy. Of course not. Taiwan had reached a point where, and South Korea too, where it would be difficult to not get democracy increasingly, but it's not automatic. You have specific leaders that bring it in, and they tend to get credit as being the heroes who all by themselves did it, but of course they were riding a wave of change.
Taiwan isn't the only one to follow this pattern. Some call India the largest democracy in the world, yet it is hardly a perfect democracy. Considering that China has already zoomed way ahead of India economically, is it possible that China will also one day surpass India as a democracy?
The good news is China is developing increasingly in the long run a self-confident and increasingly articulate, educated public who increasingly will push for free choice.
When it comes to culture, we've only scratched the surface here. We've talked about the fact that democracy isn't spreading very well. There's the difference between rich countries and poor ones. Then there's the comparison of countries that have developed well over the last 50 years and those that haven't. If you consider all the data, it sure seems like we are missing something when it comes to democracy. That missing factor is culture. As a final thought, consider America and how its culture has changed over the last 50 years. Think about the impact that change has had on American society. If we are that different from ourselves just 50 years ago, why would we expect other countries to be so similar to us that we don't even have to consider their culture? Since culture has played such a big role in the US, doesn't it make sense that culture would be important to other countries as well? The world really is getting smaller. Many of the opportunities and most of the risks are with developing countries. It's never been more important for us to understand the rest of the world. If we're to do that, and if we really want to spread prosperity and democracy, we need to pay more attention to the one factor that seems so critically important: culture.